Evelyn had always been drawn to the obscure. There was something irresistible about the forbidden, the unknown. She often found herself wandering through old, crumbling libraries, scanning dusty pages of books she couldn't even read. That was where she had first encountered the man. He appeared in the shadows like a ghost emerging from the dark corners of forgotten pages. A figure too smooth, too polished to be real. A client of the select, he called himself. Evelyn wasn't foolish. She knew there was something wrong about the man, but the promises he made were too tempting to ignore. Power, immortality, secrets too grand for ordinary minds. The contract. The paper was old, yellowed, and written in elegant, impossible script. But the words weren't what caught her attention. It was the promise, the offer, the price. She signed without hesitation. She needed it. And so she did. She felt the blood rush from her veins and the darkness creep up her spine. But Evelyn didn't flinch. She only smiled, imagining the endless possibilities of the future she was about to command. Then, the world shifted. Days passed, and Evelyn didn't notice the first change. The whispers at the edge of her consciousness. The feeling of eyes watching her, even in the solitude of her own home. But that night, as she lay in bed, something shifted inside her. Her shadow moved. She lay still, staring at the outline against the wall, as her own form pulled away, reaching for her with arms that were not her own. The days passed in an eerie blur. Evelyn could feel the world around her changing, though she couldn't quite pinpoint why. The air felt thicker, more oppressive, as though the walls themselves were pressing in on her. Each breath was heavier than the last, and each morning, she awoke feeling different. Her reflection in the mirror was the first sign. At first, she thought it was exhaustion, too many sleepless nights tangled in thoughts of the contract. But as she stood before the mirror one morning, brushing her hair, Evelyn realized something was wrong. Her eyes, her once bright, curious eyes, seemed deeper, shadowed, hollow almost, like they no longer belonged to her. And that wasn't the worst of it. When she reached up to touch her face, her reflection moved too slowly, a moment behind. At first, she thought she had imagined it, a trick of the light. But as she repeated the motion, she realized the truth. Her reflection was no longer her own. It was like watching a stranger, someone who mimicked her every move, yet twisted it. Her fingers trembled as they traced the outline of her face, the skin colder than it should be. She had to tear her eyes away from the mirror. What have I done? But it was too late to go back now. The contract was sealed. That afternoon, Evelyn searched the house for any trace of the paper, but the contract, that damn thing, had vanished, as though it had never existed. Her heart raced. She tried to recall the words she had signed, but they were slipping away from her. It wasn't until she found the note that she remembered. A single delicate slip of paper appeared on her desk. It was marked in the same ink as the contract, but this time it was only one line. "You belong to us now. The change has begun." A cold breeze swept through the room, and Evelyn turned just in time to see her reflection in the window. Smiling, she shot up, gasping for air. But when she turned to the corner, there was no shadow left. Just the faint, unsettling sound of breathing that wasn't hers. The following days felt like a nightmare. Evelyn could no longer distinguish between waking and sleeping. She was trapped in a haze, unable to tell if the shadows were following her or if they were merely a trick of her own mind. The whispers came at night, always just outside her reach, never loud enough to understand. But there was one thing she couldn't deny. Something had changed. Her body felt alien. She would glance at her hands and wonder if they were truly hers. The sharpness of her nails, the coldness of her skin, it was as if she were becoming a stranger to herself. But what terrified her most was the growing feeling that she was losing control. One night she woke to the sound of a soft scratching at her door. It wasn't a normal sound, it was deliberate, intentional. She rose from her bed, heart pounding, and moved toward the source of the noise. As she reached for the door handle, a sudden dread gripped her and her fingers froze. The door opened by itself. Evelyn stood in the doorway staring into the hallway, which was dark and unnervingly still. She stepped forward, but her legs felt heavier, as if the floor beneath her was pressing against her with increasing force. In the dim light, something was different. The hallway seemed to stretch further, the walls bending slightly, as though they were alive. And in the distance, she saw it. The figure. Her. Not just her reflection, but her. The woman that stood at the end of the hallway was smiling, a cold, sinister grin that sent a wave of nausea through Evelyn. It wasn't her. Evelyn took a step back. Her breath caught in her throat. Her own reflection had never felt so alien. This wasn't just a trick of the light. This was something more. She turned to run, but something stopped her. The shadows. They reached out, crawling across the walls, pulling at her legs. She tried to scream, but her voice was muffled as though the world itself was choking her. As she fell to her knees, she heard a voice, a low, guttural sound, coming from the darkness. "You are ours now." It wasn't the first time she had heard the words, but this time it felt different. It felt real. As she struggled to rise, the woman in the hallway took a step toward her. The shadow on the floor began to move independently, pulling itself closer, slithering like a living thing. Evelyn's reflection stepped forward too, but it wasn't smiling anymore. It was grinning. Evelyn's world had become unrecognizable. The shadows were no longer mere observers. They were her companions, her tormentors. They followed her everywhere, their cold fingers always brushing against her skin, always whispering things she couldn't understand. She was no longer certain where she ended and where it began. The reflection in the mirror, the figure in the hallway, they were becoming one and the same. Her movements had become erratic, unpredictable. Her body no longer obeyed her will, as if some dark force had taken the reins, and then came the dreams. At night, she would drift into a sleep too deep to escape. She saw herself, her true self, standing at the edge of a vast, endless abyss. The sky above was black, the stars blurring into the void. There was a figure in the distance cloaked in shadow, and Evelyn felt an overwhelming pull to walk toward it. Each step felt heavier, as if the very air around her thickened with every motion. The figure remained still, yet Evelyn could feel its presence suffocating her, drowning her. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. Her legs betrayed her, each step like quicksand pulling her deeper into the unknown. And then she woke up. Her body was drenched in cold sweat. The room was dark, but the shadows lingered in the corners, stretching and shifting like living things. Her heart raced. She was no longer alone. In the dim light, she saw it. A figure standing at the end of the room, motionless. Her reflection. Evelyn's breath hitched as she realized. It wasn't just following her anymore. It was becoming her. The shadow at the edge of the room stretched toward her, its form solidifying into something human, but not quite. It had no face, only an outline of the woman she once was. And then, the reflection spoke. "You were never meant to exist alone." The words were chilling, each syllable hanging in the air like poison. Evelyn could feel her knees trembling beneath her, but it wasn't fear that gripped her. It was rage. She lunged toward the figure, screaming, but her arms didn't obey. Instead, her body froze, caught in a strange, unnatural paralysis. The more she struggled, the tighter the grip of the shadows became. They curled around her legs, her arms, her neck, until she could no longer breathe. She had no choice. The contract had bound her, and now she was a prisoner of the shadows that had once been hers. The figure in the corner stepped forward, its grin widening. Evelyn could see the smile now, a sharp, cruel thing that wasn't hers. The reflection whispered, low and steady, "You are mine now." And then, everything went black. The darkness had consumed Evelyn completely. There was no escaping it now. The shadows wrapped around her, bound her until she couldn't remember who she was or who she had been. She was no longer Evelyn, she was a creature, a thing that existed only to fulfill its purpose, a thing that was no longer fully human. But there was one final piece of herself left, and it was fading. Rafael, the man who had unknowingly become her anchor, her last tie to the world she had once known. He was still alive, but trapped. As she gazed into his eyes, she saw a reflection of the woman she had once been, and it broke her. Rafael had no idea what was happening to her, to them. She had been so careful not to let him see the changes, to hide the growing darkness that wrapped around her soul. But the shadows had other plans. One night, she couldn't hold it back any longer. The mirror cracked, and with it, the last of her humanity. She stood before him, feeling the coldness of the room pressing against her skin. He was sitting, staring at her, eyes dull, as if under a spell he couldn't break. Evelyn could feel the power of the contract pulsing through her, stronger now than ever before. Her reflection stood behind her, smiling a cruel, unrecognizable smile. "You have nothing left," it whispered. She looked at Rafael. His eyes were distant, clouded. He didn't understand. He never would. But then, something changed in him. His hand reached out, as if he felt the weight of the darkness pulling him. Rafael spoke, his voice barely a whisper. I knew you weren't her." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Evelyn felt something, a sliver of regret. But it was too late. The darkness had already taken root. With one final, almost imperceptible motion, she moved toward him. She could feel her form warping, twisting with the pull of the shadows. Her reflection stepped forward too, mirroring her movements, yet always a fraction behind. It was too late to escape, too late to turn back. Evelyn felt the last of her humanity slipping away as her hand touched Rafael's. And then, nothing. Rafael's eyes fluttered. There was a moment of clarity, and for a brief instant he seemed to see through the veil of darkness. But as he reached for her, Evelyn, the real Evelyn, was no longer there. Only the shadow, the reflection, the creature that had taken her place. The last light flickered out. When the darkness finally receded, there was nothing left but emptiness. Rafael stood alone, the room silent except for the sound of his own breath, ragged and shallow. His hand hovered in the air where Evelyn had been just moments ago. The air felt colder now, almost as if it had absorbed every ounce of warmth and light in the room. He stared at the place where she had been, at the shadow now standing in the corner of the room, her reflection still grinning, still waiting. "You were never meant to save her," the shadow whispered in a voice that was eerily familiar. Rafael stepped back, his heart hammering in his chest. The woman in front of him, the thing that looked like Evelyn, wasn't her. It couldn't be. There was no life in its eyes, no warmth, no love, just an endless, consuming darkness. He could feel the weight of it, the contract, the price that had been paid in blood. It was all too clear now. Evelyn had made her choice, and she was lost. Forever. The darkness began to creep, curling around him like the coils of a serpent. It was as though it had a life of its own, a malevolent force pulling him toward it. His fingers twitched, but he could no longer control them. His feet moved of their own accord, each step taking him closer to the edge of the abyss. And there, at the center of the room, the shadow waited. The reflection in the mirror was no longer just a reflection. It had become real. "You belong to us now," the shadow murmured. Rafael's chest tightened as he felt his body giving in. The shadow reached out, its form shifting like a living thing, and for the first time, Rafael understood the true cost of the contract. It wasn't just Evelyn, who had been claimed. It was them both. The world around him blurred. He could feel himself falling deeper into something he could never escape. And in that moment, he realized the horrifying truth. The contract had never just been for Evelyn. It had always been meant for both of them. The last thing he Heard was a whisper, not from Evelyn, but from the reflection that now stood where she once had. The price is paid. You are ours. And then, silence. The darkness consumed him whole, leaving nothing behind but an endless void. The darkness has claimed them both. There's no turning back now. Evelyn is lost forever, nothing but a shadow of her former self. And Rafael? He too has become part of the contract, a mere echo in the void. What awaits them in the end? Perhaps something even darker than they ever could have imagined. Did Evelyn make the right choice? Or was it all part of something far more terrifying than she could ever have known? Thank you for joining this twisted journey. If you've been gripped by the terror of the contract of blood, don't forget to like, comment, and share. What do you think really happened to them? Was it inevitable, or could they have escaped? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe for more spine-chilling stories, and make sure to hit the bell so you never miss what's coming next. The night carried an air of suffocation, thick as a burial shroud. Mariana walked with measured steps, the heels of her boots clicking against the wet pavement like a hesitant heartbeat. The streets, though familiar, seemed elongated, twisted by a subtle, imperceptible force. She was not alone. A presence loomed, silent yet overwhelming. She felt it first, a whisper of breath where none should be, a shift in the shadows that did not belong to her own. And then there she was. Across the street, under the flickering light of a dying lamppost, stood a woman veiled in black. She did not move, did not breathe. The fabric of her mourning attire seemed to drink the surrounding light, as if she were a void in the shape of a woman. Mariana's breath hitched. The sensation was more than fear. It was recognition. "Do you see her?" she whispered, though she knew the answer. Her friends laughed, unaware of the silent specter watching. "See who?" one of them asked, tilting his head. Mariana turned back, but the woman had drawn closer. Not a step had been heard, yet she was nearer now, just at the edge of the sidewalk. A violent shiver ran down Mariana's spine. Her heart pounded. The air thickened, pressing against her chest as if unseen hands were tightening around her ribs. Then a voice, soft, delicate, yet carrying the weight of something ancient, whispered her name. Mariana whipped around. The street was empty. The world buzzed on as though nothing had shifted, as though reality had not just bent around her. She let out a trembling breath and turned back to her friends, forcing a nervous chuckle. But then, the laughter around her faded, swallowed by a silence. So absolute it rang in her ears, a darkness fell over the table, like an eclipse blotting out light. She was no longer outside. A chill crept into her bones. The air smelled of damp earth, of something rotting beneath the surface. Mariana lifted her gaze and froze. The woman in the veil now sat across from her at the very table where her friends had been. The world had hollowed itself around her. The distant murmur of traffic, the indistinct chatter of the city, all had fallen away, as though she had slipped into some hidden pocket of existence where only she and the veiled woman remained. The figure sat motionless, hands folded over one another in a posture that should have been elegant but felt inherently wrong, like a corpse posed in a coffin. Mariana could not breathe. The air had thickened, congealed in her throat. Her pulse pounded against her temples as she tried to look away, to break the invisible force that bound her eyes to the shrouded specter before her. A whisper, distant yet near, spoke her name. Mariana swallowed hard. "Who are you?" The woman did not respond. Her head tilted slightly, just enough for the dim light to catch a sliver of the face beneath the veil. Mariana's stomach clenched. The jawline, the curve of the cheek, they were eerily familiar. No, impossible. The shadows within the veil shifted, swirled. Something moved beneath the fabric, something alive. A flicker, a subtle change. Mariana blinked, and in that single breath, the woman was gone. She gasped, shoving, herself back from the table so violently that her chair scraped against the floor. The city's noise rushed back in all at once, an overwhelming cacophony of laughter, clinking glasses and honking horns. Her friends were still there, mid-conversation, as if no time had passed at all. Her hands trembled, her skin felt cold. Had she imagined it? A hallucination born from exhaustion? A soft vibration in her pocket pulled her back to reality. Her phone, a message. Unknown number. Do not go to him. Mariana's breath caught. She turned her phone over in her hands, feeling the weight of something far beyond the physical pressing down on her. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it, across the street. Beneath the same dim lamplight as before, the woman of the veil stood once more, but this time, she was closer. Sleep had abandoned her. Mariana lay awake, staring at the ceiling as shadows crawled across it, shifting with each passing hour. The city outside was alive, but her apartment felt abandoned, detached, as if she no longer truly existed within its walls. She had drawn the curtains, locked the door twice, even turned on the television for some semblance of normalcy. But none of it mattered. The woman was still there, not outside, not on the street inside. She saw her in the mirror of the bathroom, standing just behind her reflection. In the glass of her phone screen, a shadow stretching toward her. In the darkened TV screen, where the static should have been empty, but wasn't. Mariana tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself that it was exhaustion, that she was seeing things that weren't there. But then came the whispers, not from the walls, not from the night, from inside her own head. They slithered through her thoughts like smoke, curling around her memories, distorting her reality. She pressed her palms against her temples, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Stop," she whispered. "Please stop." A vibration on the nightstand. Her phone. She reached for it with trembling fingers. A new message. Unknown number. "Look at your hand." Mariana hesitated, dread pooling in her stomach. Slowly, she lifted her left hand to the dim glow of the screen. Her breath hitched. A ring encircled her finger. A delicate band of silver, simple but unmistakable. She had never owned a ring like this. But she had seen it before. On the woman of the veil. A cold realization coiled around her ribs, suffocating her. The whispers grew louder, laughing now, feeding on her dread. Mariana turned toward the mirror. Her own reflection did not move. Her heart seized. The Mariana in the glass stood still, unblinking, a cruel mockery of her. And then, the reflection smiled. A smile that did not belong to her, a smile that was wrong. The lights flickered. The air turned thick, heavy with something unseen. Then, in the darkness of the mirror, a second figure emerged. The woman of the veil, standing just behind her, closer than ever. Mariana could not recall falling asleep, and yet, she awoke. The room was shrouded in an unnatural darkness, not the simple absence of light, but a void, thick and suffocating. Her breath came ragged, uneven, her limbs leaden as if something unseen pressed her into the mattress. She was not alone. A presence lurked in the shadows. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, her body screaming at her to move, but something held her still. A paralysis that felt more than physical. Then the bed sank, as if something had sat down beside her. The air chilled, each breath leaving her lips as a ghostly wisp. Slowly, so painfully slowly, she turned her head toward the presence. And there she was, the woman of the veil, closer than ever, no longer across the street, no longer just a reflection. She sat beside Mariana, her presence an abyss of unnatural silence. The veil obscured her face, but the fabric shifted, something moving beneath it, breathing. Then, she reached out. Mariana's body convulsed as cold fingers brushed against hers. The touch was familiar, too familiar. Memories crashed through her mind. Visions. Her own hands, aged, trembling, slipping on a wedding ring, the same silver band now on her finger. Her stomach twisted. "No," Mariana rasped. The woman lifted her veil. Mariana's world shattered. The face beneath was hers, but not hers. Older, hollowed. A reflection of what she would become. A whisper slithered through the silence. Her own voice, yet not her own. "You cannot stop what is coming." The weight of inevitability crushed her. This was not just a haunting, not a ghost. It was her future. A Mariana who had seen the end. A Mariana who had come back to stop herself. Her throat tightened. "What happens to me?" The older version of herself simply smiled, a sorrowful, knowing curve of the lips. And then she whispered something. A single sentence that sent Mariana's mind spiraling into darkness. "He is waiting." The world around her fractured. Mariana stumbled backward, her breath ragged, her mind drowning in the echo of those whispered words. "He is waiting." Who? Where? Why did she know the answer before even asking? The shadows in the room thickened, curling along the walls like ink spilled in water. Her own reflection in the mirror remained frozen, staring back at her. But the older version of herself was gone. No, not gone. She was inside her now. A surge of memories. No, premonitions pierced her skull. Visions of a path already walked, of screams swallowed by the void, of a presence just beyond sight, always waiting, always watching. Her hands trembled. The silver ring on her finger burned cold against her skin. Something was pulling her, not physically, deeper than that. A force within her very soul, like an unseen chain tightening around her ribs, yanking her toward a door she had never noticed before. Door at the end of the hallway. She had lived in this apartment for years, but that door had never been there before, and yet she knew. She had walked through it before. A cold sweat dripped down her spine. Her feet moved against her will, her body a puppet on invisible strings. The whispers returned, not in her head this time, but in the walls, in the air, in the very fabric of existence. The doorknob was ice under her touch. She turned it. The door swung open. Darkness. Not emptiness. Something within it. Something breathing. A shape. A man, tall, waiting. His presence was a weight, an abyss in the shape of a person. No face, no features, just the crushing certainty that he had always been there, waiting for her. Mariana's breath hitched. Every version of her had come to this moment. Every version had failed. She tried to scream, but the door slammed shut behind her. Darkness swallowed her whole, and somewhere, in the suffocating void, a deep voice whispered, "It is done." Darkness, endless, consuming. Mariana no longer knew if she was standing, falling, or drifting through the void that had become her reality. The whispers that once lurked at the edge of her mind were now a chorus, a ceaseless murmur of voices overlapping. Indistinct, yet overwhelming. But one voice rose above them all. His. "All paths lead to me." A hand, cold, impossibly strong, closed around her wrist. The silver ring on her finger burned like frostbite, and in that moment she understood. There was never a choice. Never an escape. She had seen her future because it had already happened. Again, and again, and again. This was the fate she had always tried to outrun. And now, just like all the versions before her, she had failed. The whispers faded. The void collapsed. And Mariana was gone.